this event. The first thing that I'd like to say is that resonates deeply, is that it seems to me that the question of comparing France and the US in terms of immigration is complicated these days in France. For example, if we were to mention the number of people who were expelled from the US on a yearly basis, I think it would justify many French people in thinking that, after all, we're not doing that bad. That's one of the reasons why, in spite of my own interest in the US and in French-American comparisons, I've systematically avoided making this transatlantic comparison between France and the US, because I think it would defeat the purpose of pointing out how dreadful the situation has been in France in some ways. However, I think it is an interesting comparison, and I will make a few suggestions in that direction. My argument in these few minutes will be focused on the link, which I think is different in France and in the US, between race and immigration, which I think is a different combination, and I want to present that with two aspects. The first one has to do with the so-called problem of immigration. As you may know, in France, the discussions about immigration have been focused on this obvious fact that there is a problem of immigration. The comparison with the US is actually quite interesting, because if you think of the number of illegal immigrants in France, apparently it's somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 for a population of 65 million. Now, if you compare that to the US, you see that, in fact, if we're talking about an objective problem, whatever that means, that is in terms of numbers, we're clearly not in the same league. That is, if you think of, say, 11 million in the US, concentrated in specific states, then clearly the question of, are we talking about a big problem or a small problem? And again, for the moment, I'm leaving out the question of whether it is a problem, but we're not talking about the same weight of this issue. Now, on the one hand, then, objectively, in terms of numbers, immigration, or at least illegal immigration, shouldn't be such a problem in France compared to the US. However, in political discourse, it has been much more of a problem in France than it has been in the US. I'm not saying that there's no discussion of immigration in the US. I'm quite aware of the fact that it's also a political issue. But I think it would be safe to argue that in France, the last 30 years have been defined by the so-called problem of immigration in public discourse. So, on the one hand, objectively in terms of numbers, immigration is a bigger issue in the US, but in political terms, it's a bigger problem in France. Now, if we take that seriously, that helps understand how it's worked in France. If you listen to politicians, what they say is there is a problem with immigration, and our job is to resolve that problem. But if you think it's not just an issue, but it's a political problem, then you can turn things around. The job of politicians has not been to resolve a problem, it has been to fuel a problem, to make it last, not to make it go away. And this you can see in the current political campaign. You can see that basically whatever suggestion is made that we should do this or that, well, someone has to up the ante. Someone has to say, we'll go further. So for example, if François Hollande, the socialist candidate, starts saying we should do a case-by-case resolution of the immigration problem, which used to be the discourse of the right, and of Sarkozy says, that's the problem. You do case by case, that means you're going to legalize everyone. Or if Nicolas Sarkozy says, contrary to what he said before, I oppose the vote of foreigners in local elections, then Marine Le Pen, the extreme right candidate, ups the ante and says the problem is not the vote. It's that you're naturalizing so many foreigners. So the logic of this is not to resolve the problem, but to continue it, to make it bigger. And one of the ways in which it was made bigger by Nicolas Sarkozy was when he changed the problem, that is the formulation of the problem in 2005 by introducing the opposition between immigration subie, immigration choisie, immigration chosen or not. Now, what is interesting is that this change of language made it possible to leave out the question of whether we're talking about illegal immigration, and made it possible to start addressing legal immigration as a problem, because it was not chosen, because it was family immigration, through reunification, through binational marriages, so it was not chosen by the state. Therefore, it was part of the problem. So the shift of language was meant to make what could be a small problem, a few 100,000 illegal immigrants, into a big problem. There's all kinds of foreigners of all kinds who are legal or not. Now, one aspect of this is that, of course, it makes it more and more into a racial problem. That is, it's not just an immigration problem. Immigration has become a sort of code word for talking about race in France. If we were just talking about the 400,000 illegal immigrants, well, that would be fine. But in fact, when we're talking about immigrants, as you know in France, we're talking also about the descendants of immigrants. We're not just talking about foreigners, we're talking about French citizens. And this is the second point that I want to make before using up all my time. Now, if we have a problem of immigration, we can imagine that there will be a sharp division between right and left on this issue. As you know, that hasn't quite been the case. And if you've watched part of the debate, you may have burst into tears as you heard François Hollande conceding so much ground. Now, what is interesting is, on the one hand, we know why the right has been developing this discourse about immigration as a problem, and at the same time about Islam as a problem, conflating the two. The logic of national identity that has been defended by the right, first by the extreme right, then by the right, and now the division between the two is quite unclear to me, and I think to many. So this evolution of the right makes sense. In fact, they're talking about race, they're talking about national identity, but we know that national identity means others, and the term immigration and national identity that defined the ministry that was created by Nicolas Sarkozy in 2007, in fact, made it very easy to understand that it was us versus them, and there was a racialization of them. And them, of course, would mean all kinds of people, and us only meant us white people, implicitly and more explicitly. Now, this racialization of the so-called immigration issue is not specific to the right. I think the reason why we can worry about what's going on in France today, and this I think introduces a difference with the American situation, is that the combination with race plays differently, and in particular on the left. Now, if you look at the French situation, you see that the socialist candidate has not dared oppose immigration policies as they have been developed. Basically, he's done the same thing that we heard Souleymane Bachir do 5 years ago, which is basically to say, I will do the same thing but in more humane fashion. Why doesn't the left, or at least the socialist left, clearly break away from this right-wing discourse about immigration? One argument that we make in the book Xenophobia from the Top is that it has to do with a representation of the working class or of the people. The left in France has been traumatized by the fact that many working class voters have deserted the left, and some have chosen the National Front. Others in 2007 apparently preferred Nicolas Sarkozy. Now, the idea is that if we want to win back these voters, we need to talk about national identity. And in fact, we need to talk about whiteness. That, I think, has been the center of the political discourse that has been developed on the left. The only way many people on the left think, and in my view, wrongly, to win back the popular vote, that is, the working class vote, is to emphasize whiteness. And so in many ways, what is happening is comparable to an issue that I think in the US people are quite familiar with. The issue of whiteness was developed, the works on whiteness have been in part developed in the context of the 1980s, that is, of the Reagan Democrats, these working class voters who chose to side with the Republicans for racial reasons. Now, that is quite interesting because, in fact, I think the difference between the French context today and the politics of whiteness and the politics of whiteness in the 1980s in the US and since is that in the US it was not so much about immigration. The politics of whiteness that developed then were about African Americans, not about immigrants. I think there was not a primary focus. The second difference, and I will conclude with that, the second difference between the French and the American situations on this issue is that if we compare what happened in terms of race, I think there has developed in France and throughout Europe a new theme, which I think defines Europe in many ways today in a way that it hasn't defined the US. I think whiteness is not just about whiteness, it's about sexual whiteness. That is, it's not just about the working class, it's about the difference between us and them. And what is the difference between us and them? Well, if you're a racist, you say it's because they're different. But if you're modern and democratic, you say it's because they don't treat their women well. That means that you're not in any way renouncing democracy. On the contrary, you're defending sexual democracy, the rights of women. Why not the rights of gays? And the reason why you're defending us is because you want to preserve democratic values. This theme, which you find in the Netherlands, for example, but throughout Europe, I think is one of the keys to understanding the new meaning of whiteness in Europe, which I think is relatively different from what has been encountered in the US in the last generations, and I will stay quiet for now.